So why didn't I record a top 10 video in December like everyone else? Because two of the books I read in December are on this list. So 2023 was a great year in reading for me. The last couple of months, 2 or 3 months actually of 2023, I really didn't make a lot of long form YouTube videos, though I did make some shorts here and there. But I was really occupied with, between the holidays, family time, and a lot of reading kind of occupied my time. So I decided that I would put off making any new videos until the beginning of 2024. So here we are. So today's video is a very special video for me. I've been excited about doing it. It is my top 10 reads of 2023. If you follow FanFanatic blog, then I've already put out my top 5 fantasy books, which all of those would be on this list. But this is not just my top 5 or top 10 fantasy. This is my top 10 books, no matter what genre of the year. So let's go over that. First of all, coming in at number 10 was Ryan Cahill's Of Darkness and Light. This is the second book of his series, The Bound and the Broken, a continuation from obviously where the story began. It picks up immediately in the middle of a battle. If you're not familiar, I'm not really going to give any spoilers, but it picks up in the middle of a battle and just tells an amazing story. I would say that there was a portion where I thought it was starting to lag a little bit. The story was starting to lag. I've even seen other people say the same thing, but looking back, it was just building and building and building into a wonderful story. Full disclosure, I'm currently reading the third book of this series, of War and Ruin, and had I finished it in 2023, it probably would have this slot. So again, I'm only doing one book per author. So it would have taken this spot, I imagine. But this was a magnificent book. I loved the ending. There was something in the end of this book that connected it with towards the beginning of the first book. And I love when an author does that. I love when an author surprises you and connects pieces, connects the dots. So that was number 10. Number 9, what fills this position is A Fool's Hope by Mike Shackle. I take a lot of recommendations from a lot of different booktubers, but the first one I found on BookTube when I discovered what BookTube was Mike Shackle, was Mike from Mike Book Reads. And toward the beginning of this year, he talked about wanting to read this grimdark series, and I had never read a grimdark book before this. I love classic fantasy, but I never read a grimdark fantasy. But Mike from Mike's Book Read said he was going to read the Last War series trilogy, and so I said, you know what, I'm going to dive into that as well. And I did, and the first book blew me away. We Are the Dead. A lot of people have talked about that this year. Just an outstanding book. But then this book happened, and there was not a moment from opening the book to closing the book where I was bored in any way. You know, I don't mind a slow burn book. I don't mind. I'm used to reading long fantasies where there's a journey of some kind. I don't mind reading long, drawn out stories. This wasn't long or drawn out. This was action-packed from beginning to end, very much grimdark. Of course, there are things that would make you uncomfortable as you read some of the content. There's a lot of content warnings that you should know about, but as you read it, but still the story that's being told. And something that I love about these books is in the midst of being grimdark. You know, sometimes they say grimdark is just without hope, or it can be without hope. This was grimdark while still maintaining hope, and I greatly appreciated that. That's why this is number 9 of my top 10 list. Number 8. Now, there are a few of these books that came later in the year. I didn't expect this one. Not that I had heard anything negative about it, but even when I started reading it, I didn't expect this to make my top 10 list. I think I read it in November, maybe October. But anyway, I read The Severing Sun by Vaughn Roycroft, and I fell into the story. I became lost in the story. First of all, look at the art on that book. It is just absolute beauty. but the story is even more beautiful. I'm not really going to go into a lot of the plot of it, but you see revenge, you see finding yourself, you see some romance, you see all sorts of things like that, and it is just a wonderful story. In fact, he's continuing on this year. He just released the second book in this series, and I'm excited about getting to that. But this book took me by storm. It blew me away, knocked me off my feet. I keep saying all sorts of things about it. But anyway, a lot of people have talked about this book. If you haven't checked it out, check out The Severing Son by Von Roycroft. At number 7, this is a book that I read with some friends of mine in January. And as soon as I finished this book, I'm just going to be honest with you. I'm just going to be transparent with you. As soon as I finished this book, I closed it. I listed it on my Pango Books account and said, I'm going to sell this book. I never want to read this book again because it depressed me so much. And it didn't sell. But the more I thought about it, the story stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about it for even a couple of months after that. So I took it off Pango Books. I was glad it didn't sell. I took it off Pango Books and I began to kind of reminisce over some things from the book. And I knew that it was going to be one of my top 10 books. In fact, it came in number 7, The Road by Cormac McCarthy. Now, this is nothing like a book that I would normally read. But that's something I've really appreciated about BookTube this year and other forms of the book community is I have found other books, other genres that have impressed me and that I have enjoyed reading. And this would be one of them. The Road by Cormac McCarthy. Again, as I've already said, it's depressing from beginning to end. You enter into, I can see the color gray in my mind as I'm reading this book. The world is gray, the world is dark, but you see a relationship, and I don't think this is a spoiler. You see a relationship between a father and a son that you just immerse yourself in it. And you dread things taking place. You want to see the son protected. You want to see the father experience some happiness. And so anyway, it stuck with me. And so that's what made it my number 7. At number 6, this is one of the books that I read in December. It is the third book, of Live Ship Traders' Ship of Destiny by Robin Hobb. I really enjoyed the first book of Live Ship Traders, Ship of Magic. It was great. I enjoyed the second book. Though I'll say in the second book, Mad Ship, there was the first, probably third or a little more than first third. I was a little disappointed. I felt like they weren't really talking about anything I wanted. It kind of lost me. I almost DNF'd. Or at least paused as I was reading Mad Ship. But then the story took off, and it was wonderful after that. After probably the first third of the book. So the next 2/3 was great. But then I read this. I read it this past month in December. One of the last books I read of the month, and it was outstanding. Of course, when you read Robin Hobb, you know that you're going to have beautiful prose. You know you're going to have in-depth character work. Probably the only author, as far as the authors that I love, to really rival Stephen King in the character work that he does. You just love sitting down with these characters and learning more about them, even as sometimes they do nothing. You love learning about them. And so anyway, this book, number 6, is in my top 10, Ship of Destiny. All right, now we have come to the top 5. The number 5 is Excalibur by Bernard Cornwell. Now, after I read the second book of this series, which was The Enemy of God, I thought, well, this is going to be my favorite book in the series. And this only surpassed it just by a little bit. I love the second book. Enemy of God was everything I wanted that series to be. This was, except I loved the ending. I don't know what I was expecting. I think I don't know if I want to say gullible reader, or I just go with the flow, basically. I'm usually, it's hard to disappoint me in some ways with the story because I just go along with whatever the author says. But the ending of this book, I felt good. I was satisfied. I started actually thinking as I was approaching the end, I think I knew where he was going with it, and he did, and I enjoyed it. I loved it. This is the third and final book of the Warlord Chronicles, Excalibur. I love Arthurian legend. If you haven't picked it up, you need to. It is amazing. Number 4. Now, this is a book. In fact, it almost didn't qualify as a 2023 read, because I actually picked it up and started in 2022. But then I read the vast majority of it in 2023. I had just started, I think, last December. I read most of it in 2023. And when I say most of it in 2023, it took me all of 2023 to read it. Not because of the length necessarily. There was no lag in my enjoyment of it. I hit sort of a reading slump about halfway through this book, and so I put it away and then picked it back up the end of November and the beginning of December. So this was my first book to complete in December. So it took me a year to read it, and that is The Stand. Of course, you know how thick that is. The Stand by Stephen King. I basically knew the story. My dad was a big Stephen King fan. He loved Stephen King books. We watched the miniseries that came on back in the 90s. And as we watched it, he would tell us some of the differences between the miniseries and the book. And so I grew up loving the story. But I had never really experienced it, I don't think, until I read what he actually wrote. Stephen King is definitely one of my top authors. I don't know if I want to say first yet or not, but he's up there. This is just, if you don't know what it's about, I'm sure most of you probably already do. The world is in the midst of a pandemic. I know that brings back probably nightmares for what we had experienced. But if you thought 2020 was bad, you should read what happened in this book. And so anyway, it seems like everything is just physical and natural, the things that are going on, and then you see a supernatural aspect of what's actually happening, and you see the group. This is a battle between two groups. One somewhat evil. I won't say the villain wasn't evil, but you may can question whether or not all the people were. And the other group, which was basically good, and they come against one another. Something I appreciate about Stephen King's writing is, yes, there are gray characters, but he also does a really good job at putting light versus darkness. And I think that comes out in this book, which is my number 4 book of the year, The Stand. All right, at number 3. So you can see over my shoulder, I don't know if you can make that out, but that is Pierce Brown's series, the Red Rising novels. Again, Mike from Mike's Book Read really introduced me to this series. I began reading it with him. He was doing a reread, and so I was doing my first read while he was doing his reread. I loved following along with his videos with the Howler Pod. And then finally, July came when Lightbringer hit the shelves, and I had pre-ordered it. I was expecting, I was excited about reading this book, and I put it away in a pretty short amount of time, even though it's a pretty thick book. But every book got better to me. The 4th book, Iron Gold, I had some issues with, but it was still a great book. But they seemed to get better with each book, and then Lightbringer came, and I absolutely loved it. There are answers to questions in this book. Not all the answers to all the questions, but there are some answers to questions in this book. There is great conversations, philosophical conversations between characters, which is just, we've come to know and love, particularly in his writing. There is a fight scene, which to me is the best fight scene of the whole series so far. I was doing fist pumps in the air while I was reading it. It just excited me. And so if you have not picked up the Red Rising series, or if you've not read the sequel books yet, please start, because the story is not over with Morningstar. My number 2 book of the year. Now, I said that this list is going to incorporate more than one genre. So these are all my favorite books of the year. This is my last fantasy book. So this, even though it's number 2 in my overall enjoyment of the books I read this year, this is my number 1 fantasy book. And this probably doesn't come as a surprise for anyone if you've kept up with past videos or things I say on Twitter, because I've already said it's my favorite fantasy book many times, and that is Return to Adan by Philip Chase. Now, we all knew and loved Philip from his BookTube channel. Just I'm not the only one who said it. I'm not the first one who said it. I'm the 1,000th one who said it. He's the nicest guy on BookTube. And then I found out that he was putting out books. And so I said, well, hey, I want to get involved in that. I want to read that. So I bought the first book, which was The Way of Adam, and I loved it. And I talked about it. And I shared a review of it. And then Philip reached out to me and said, hey, I'm glad you enjoyed book 1. I'd love to send you book 2. And so he did. And The Prophet of Adam took the story of The Way of Adam and expanded it in a fantasy way. It was everything that you would want to read in a fantasy book. It had dragons, it had sword fight, it had magic, it had all sorts of things. It was amazing. And then I read this book. Now, this book incorporates those things. It is a wonderful fantasy book, but it's also, I think, just an important book. He deals with things in this book that maybe other authors don't deal with or don't deal with quite as directly as he does. The main character in this, Dayraven, is a great character. He is you see him expanded so far from book 1 to book 3. Just the way he interacts with other people, his own personal journey of becoming who he needs to be, really dealing with asking questions and dealing with the subject of death in a way that is very, very unique, has a unique spin on elves in this book. It was very, very interesting the way he presented elves. The magic system was outstanding. Through part of the series, I was a little confused with the magic system. I had fun with it, but I didn't understand it. But it eventually clicked with me. And this book was just so wonderful. I can't stop talking about it. My favorite fantasy book of 2023. I say this often. I hope it doesn't come as an offense, but probably my favorite non-Tolkien fantasy book ever, at least to this point. And so thank you, Philip, for this wonderful series and this wonderful book. And it is my number 2 book of the year. Now we come to my favorite book of the year, my favorite read of the year. This is also a book that I had watched the miniseries growing up. My father loved it. I don't actually know if he ever read the book. I don't remember him talking about it, but I watched the miniseries. And so I knew most of the story, and I would say that it was a very faithful adaptation of the book. But I read it this year, and I was blown away. Others have said it, I'll say it. Absolutely nothing happens in the first 250 pages of this book. Nothing happens. It's just meeting people and them having conversations with one another, and it's riveting. You can't put it down. It's the best character work I've ever seen in a book, and I am so thankful I read it, and that is Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. I would not consider myself, now I enjoy Westerns, but this is the only book I've ever read that would be considered a Western, but whatever you want to call it. You want to call it a Western, you want to call it literary fiction, historical fiction, whatever you want to call it. This is outstanding. If you have not read it, please pick this up. This is a book that I would call a TBR buster. If you haven't read it yet, you need to read it. I'm not trying to be preachy to you, but you need to pick this up. I have other friends who picked it up and read it. In fact, read the whole series, and they enjoyed it. This is the only book of the series I've read right now. In fact, directly behind my camera is Streets of Laredo, and I hope to get to that this year, because if it's anything like this book and anything like the character work of this book, it's going to be outstanding. It is a Pulitzer Prize winner, and there is no question that it absolutely deserved that. So thank you so much for listening to this video. Thank you for all those who've subscribed to my channel. I'd love to grow more in the future. In fact, in this time that I haven't really been putting out many videos, I've still grown by about 100 subscribers. So thank you for that. I hope it grows. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to 2024.